All right. We're live. Are you live, Kevin?
I think I should be. What is up, Craig and Jonah?
How are you, buddy? It's been a little while.
It has been. I've been in your comments. We've been talking over text, but it's been a minute since we've spoken, face to face. Well, at least as close as face to face as, the internet can get us.
Just when you thought you were escaping Discord, we drug you into ours, and it's been fun to have your perspective. Sometimes you're the most Catholic guy in the discussion, so we got to keep you around.
Hey, I'm happy to represent the Catholic side every now and then.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Craig and Jonah here. We have Kevin Non-Stratacath here. So we're streaming live somewhere, I think. We've got a few people showing up in the comments. This is my first time doing a joint live stream, only my second time doing a live at all. So bear with me. If we glitch anything, it's almost certainly my fault. So with that in mind, Kevin, why don't you get us started?
Yeah. So I think what kind of prompted this was a conversation that we only set up like a couple days ago.
Yep.
And what prompted this conversation was a comment that I left under one of your videos, right? So I believe that you were talking to, and it was kind of funny. So the podcast that you guys were doing was supposed to be there was like the Orthodox Catholic side, and then there was the maybe unorthodox Catholic side. I hope you guys don't mind me calling you unorthodox.
Oh, that's fine.
But the Orthodox Catholic position representative said something along the lines of like, well, I actually don't think it's like that big of a deal for married couples to engage in other acts. And so I left a comment saying like, that's kind of unorthodox. Like, he's sounding a little bit like he's a little uncharted himself. And so what I did was I left a little bit of a lengthy quote from a speech that Pope Pius XII gave in 1956. And you'll see people quote that like somewhat frequently. Like I'm not being original when I quoted that. But that quote talks about the intrinsic evil of these other acts. And so we decided to do a stream today where I would kind of lay out the Catholic position for the intrinsic evil nature of other acts. But then I decided, I'm not going to leave it at just the Catholic position. Obviously, I'm going to give my opinion. And what I'm kind of doing here is I'm going to make a mess. And I'm not Catholic, so I don't have to clean it up. And I'm not going to do any cleaning up today either. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explain why I think that these other acts are not intrinsically evil. And then if you're a Catholic who is very Orthodox, maybe a little bit more Orthodox than the Uncharted Catholic Man style of Catholic, you might have a little bit of cleaning up to do. And that's kind of outside the scope of today's stream. At least I don't plan on doing any cleaning up work. But I will leave that to the people who claim to be more Catholic than I am anyway. So how was that, Craig and Jonah? Did I do an all right job kind of summarizing what we're going to be discussing today?
You did.
Cool. Okay. If you want to throw up my screen, I have a little bit of a loose agenda for today. Okay, so today we are looking at the following speech from Pope Pius XII given in 1956. The entire speech is preserved on the Vatican website. You can see it here. Only problem is it's in French. Luckily, though, the Vatican website normally has several different translations available on their website. And that is the case here. If you want to translate it into Spanish, go right ahead. You can click on the Spanish one right here, French, and then Italian. So you can click on Italian right here. Unfortunately for me, the language that I'm the best in out of those three is Spanish. And I do not read Spanish well enough to try to interpret theological language in Spanish. I'm not going to hazard that. Luckily for us, there are people whose full-time job is translating like theological language into English. And so you can actually find an English translation of at least the pertinent section of that here. I will let you know that I did run this whole thing through Google Translate just to like double check this to make sure that this guy wasn't being sly with his translation or anything. And it checks out, like the translation looks right to me. Obviously, the Google Translate is like super weird with the grammar and stuff because that's what, Google Translate's not very good at translating. But this checks out. I think that this guy's translation is pretty good.
We should probably disclose who this is.
I think we should.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
What maybe I know of him. I'm not sure I know the full story, but I think he's pretty right leaning, right? He's pretty.
Yeah.
maybe that's an
He's a
understatement.
character. I think he has his own website. I believe it's Catholic
does.
Planet, and I believe he also talks about how we haven't had a pope, a valid
So
pope
he's
in quite a
instead of
while.
a is he instead of a
believe-
contest?
Yeah, this guy's a character.
Okay. all right.
So, and I should be clear, he's not a priest.
Okay.
Ron Conti is a layman.
Mhm.
He's not a priest. He's not a monk, nothing like that. He has a bachelor's degree in theology from Boston College. So don't go thinking that this man is infallible or anything. He did work, though, on several different Bible translations, including the Catholic public domain version of the Bible, which he translated from the Latin Vulgate into English. So he appears to be a pretty talented translator of like theological writing into English. And my own running of the original French through Google Translate kind of checks out. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of take him at his word that this is a pretty good translation of Pope Pius XII's original French. However, if you keep reading, he adds his own commentary,
Yeah.
and we can read it just for fun, but it's kind of out there. And that's not what I'm focusing on anyway. I'm trying to engage with Pope Pius XII. I'm not trying to engage with Ron Conti, if that makes sense.
Fair enough.
Okay, so let's read the quote from Pope Pius XII. By the force of this law of nature, the human person does not possess the right and the power to the full exercise of the sexual faculty directly intended, except when performing the conjugal act according to the norms defined and imposed by nature itself. Outside of this natural act, it is not even given within the matrimonial right itself to enjoy this sexual faculty fully. These are the limits to the particular right of which we are speaking, and they circumscribe its use according to nature. It goes on, we're skipping a portion, and then the translation continues. What has been said up to this point concerning the intrinsic evil of any full use of the generative power outside the natural conjugal act applies in the same way when the acts are of married persons or of unmarried persons. Whether the exercise of the genital organs is done by the man or by the woman or by both parties acting together, whether it is done by manual touches or by the interruption of the conjugal act, for this is always an act contrary to nature and intrinsically evil. Okay, that may have been a little bit difficult to follow. A lot of times when popes speak, it's like kind of flowery. So I'm going to give you the one sentence Kevin Non-Tradicath summary of those two paragraphs. No exercise of the sexual faculty is illicit, except when it is performed according to the norms defined and imposed by nature itself, not even within the matrimonial right, because performing the sexual faculties not according to the norms defined and imposed by nature itself is always an act contrary to nature and intrinsically evil. That's strong language, right? Intrinsically evil. And to be clear, when the Pope is talking about when he's talking about performing the marital act according to the norms defined and imposed by nature itself, that means something. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means more. We're going to dig into some Phaser mostly and some Aquinas. But I can tell you right now that what he is talking about there is making sure that no other acts can be going on. It has to be PIV. It has the I'm trying to keep this PG. The completion has to occur in such a way that babies can't procreation is possible. You can't do anything that would prevent procreation, not even if you're married. That's kind of like the important point there.
Mhm.
Before I keep going, Craig and Jonah, do you think that I did an all right job summarizing what Pope Pius said here?
Yeah, I think that. I mean that's how I look at it. I'm not.
Okay.
I agree.
Cool. So my plan for this evening is to show that this statement from Pope Pius XII is non-veridical. That is to say, my plan for tonight is to show that this proposition is not a proposition that is truthful. It is not a proposition that coincides with reality. I plan to do this by showing that natural law itself is non-veridical. But before we begin, I do want to reiterate that it is not in scope for me to clean up the mess that I am making. I am making a mess, and it is up to Catholics to clean it up. So if I kind of knock down the tower of natural law, Catholics might think to themselves like, oh shoot, what am I to do now that, like, how am I going to build my my ethical system without natural law? I'm not going to build that ethical system for you. You guys are going to have to figure that one out. And maybe that's a topic for another stream. Maybe that's a topic for somebody else besides me, probably as the outsider. But again, I just wanted to make sure that the scope for today is clear. I'm trying to show that natural law theory is non-vertical, and therefore Pope Pius XII's statement about what can and can't be done even within marriage is non-vertical. And then that's it. That's the scope. So I'm trying to keep the scope somewhat limited, even though I am biting off a lot tonight. Okay. So I think a good place to start is, what is natural law? You heard me just talk about natural law. Everything that the Pope said, he never said like, according to natural law, it is the case, but he did say something close, right? He said that whenever the act is performed not according to the norms defined and imposed by nature itself. What does that mean? Well, I can't think of a better place to go than to the philosopher Ed Feser. Ed Feser is kind of like everybody's everybody's favorite natural law professor. So yeah, I'm laughing because I clearly have my problems with Ed Feser.
We're trying to be keep my comments to myself so I can get him to come on the show and maybe clean up the mess for us. So
hey, that'd be great. I would love to speak to Ed Feser. I don't think that he might be interested in me when I get, when I 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 X my subscribers. Probably not until then. That's okay.
Yep.
So we're going to start. I have like a weird copy of this book, but this is The Last Superstition by Ed Feser. Probably my least favorite book like ever published. But and it's really just because of the tone. Like, I absolutely hate the tone of this book. For instance, I'm going to start on this paragraph, and this paragraph begins with, "But since I just ate, I'd rather leave aside Dawkins's bid to become the new Moses for the swinger set." And then he keeps going. So he's saying that I just ate, so I don't want to talk about Richard Dawkins because that's going to make me sick. Dude, you're a philosopher. Yeah. Like, can't you just engage with the ideas and like not be like petty? Like this is weird. Granted, this was written at the time of like the new atheists. So like things were contentious. You had people like Hitchens and stuff who were saying like really provocative things. So Feser's just being provocative back. So, whatever. I'm going to try to ignore. Yeah, I'm going to try to ignore the provocative language in this book. But I am going to start reading from about halfway through that paragraph, right here. So, Ed Feser writes, and is that like a little small? Do you want me to zoom in like a little bit? Maybe that's a little bit better. Okay. So Ed Feser writes, "Far from having no rational basis, the moral views now associated in the secularist mind with superstition and ignorance, in fact, follow inexorably from a consistent application of the metaphysical ideas that we've traced back through Aquinas and the other scholastic thinkers to Plato and Aristotle, the very greatest of the Greek founders of the Western intellectual tradition. In particular, this classical metaphysical picture entails a conception of morality traditionally known as natural law theory." Okay, so natural law theory is it's integral to Western philosophical thinking. It goes through the scholastics, through Aquinas, back to Aristotle and Plato. Okay, but what actually is it? Well, the nature of a thing from an Aristotelian point of view is, as we've seen, the form or essence it instantiates. Okay, that's going to be important. When we get to biological organs, we have things whose natures or essences more obviously involve certain final causes or purposes. And then I'm going to keep going on to the next page. Some defenders and critics of traditional sexual morality seem to worry themselves endlessly about whether homosexuality has a genetic basis. The question is actually largely irrelevant, though, and they shouldn't waste their time. For it is quite obvious that the existence of a genetic basis for some trait does not by itself prove anything about whether it is natural in the relevant sense. In the relevant sense, there is going to be a very important phrase, because Phaser's not talking about natural like the opposite of supernatural. No, when he's saying the word natural in natural law theory, really all of that means is comporting with its nature. So what that means is something like, even though it wouldn't be supernatural for me to consist on a diet of purely acorns, like that's not supernatural, but it's also not natural because it is not it is not of the nature of a human being to only eat acorns. That's like the nature of a squirrel, right?
Mhm.
So that's what Phaser means by natural. He's not talking about supernatural. Nor would it be plausible to suggest that God, quote, made him that way any more than God, quote, makes people to be born blind, deaf, armless, legless, prone to alcoholism, or autistic. So what Phaser's saying there is just because somebody is born such a way doesn't mean that that is natural. I may be getting a little bit of a weird feedback from your guys' end.
I reached over and my mic kind of, I think
Okay.
So it was me.
Cool. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt the flow of anything. So of course, says Phaser, this doesn't mean that homosexuality is immoral either. Now, Phaser is talking mostly about like being gay here, but the same thing applies, believe it or not, to any kind of non-procreative act between heterosexual married couples. And we'll see more in a little bit. We all know in our bones, says Phaser, that someone obsessed with masturbating to pictures of naked toddlers is sick and not not living the way a human being ought to live, even if he neither leaves the darkness of his own room and his own soul. So we all know in our bones that some things are just wrong. And according to Phaser, that means that we all know that some things are just not in our nature. Just like looking at CP is not in our nature, and we all just know that it's not in our nature. We can do the same thing with other acts, thinks Phaser. And this is more of that language that really bothers me. This is the sort of stupidity masquerading as insight that absolutely pervades modern intellectual life. And what is that? What is masquerading as insight but is really stupidity? It's the pushback that these things are mere reactions. So if anybody wants to say, well, yeah, but your personal disgust doesn't actually say anything, then Phaser says that's stupidity masquerading as insight. Gee, thanks, Phaser.
Yeah.
The abandonment of the classical realism of the great Greek and Scholastic philosophers, especially of Aristotle's doctrine of the four causes, is what is pervading modern intellectual life. And that is stupidity masquerading as insight. So if you disagree with Phaser, you're stupid. Aristotle takes a thing's form, essence, or nature to determine the good for it. Hence, a good triangle is one that corresponds as closely as possible with the form of triangularity, its sides drawn as perfectly straight as possible. Obviously, this is a non-moral sense of good. It isn't that triangles and squirrels are deserving of moral praise or blame. It's just that this is what we might think of as a good specimen or a good example of some kind or class of thing. When we turn to human beings, we too find that they have a nature or an essence, and things are good for them when defined in terms of this nature or essence. Unlike other animals, though, human beings have an intellect and will, and this is where moral goodness enters the pictures. Humans can know what is good for them and choose whether to pursue that good. Just as a good squirrel is one that successfully carries out the characteristic activities of a squirrel's life, like gathering acorns, scampering up trees, so too a good human being is one who successfully carries out the characteristic activities of the human life, as determined by the final causes or natural ends of the various faculties that are ours by virtue of our nature or our essence. And this becomes moral goodness insofar as we choose whether or not to fulfill our natures in this way. To choose in line with the final cause or purpose that are ours by nature is morally good, and to choose against them is morally bad. Phaser goes on to say that modern philosophers, overimpressed as always by David Hume, have thought that there is and is ought distinction, but Phaser just flat out denies that there is an is-ought distinction, because he kind of just like defines things. Like he's like as long as there are essences, then there is an ought, because that's like what an essence is. He admits that down here. All of this falls apart if we deny that anything has a final cause, or that there are forms, essences, or natures in the Aristotelian sense, of course. That's a pretty big admission by my lights. We're almost done with this book. Phaser says, let's return now to the question of natural law's approach to sexual morality, something that Aquinas deals with in parts 2 and 3 of the Summa. We will get back to the Summa. And it's funny that he admits that he's afraid that he is reinforcing the tiresome cliche that natural law moralists are obsessed with sex. I kind of find that funny.
Mhm.
But he says it is only those who object to what I'm teaching in this book who are obsessed. I'm not obsessed with sex. You are. Which I just think is great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then this whole page right here is pretty important. I'm just going to leave this on the page and kind of just talk through it. Phaser says that nature makes it very difficult to indulge in sex without procreation. Phaser's whole point is that it is blindingly obvious. That's an actual term that he uses on this next page right here. Let me find it. It is blindingly, I dare say, blindingly obvious right here that the nature of this act is procreation. And so doing anything that is this act, but denying the nature of that act, is bad for being a human being. That's Phaser's whole point. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop with Phaser's book. So let me pause right here and just make sure that that made, like, I'm not asking you if you agree with Phaser. I just want to make sure that it wasn't like overly complicated.
No, and I think it's funny because I think you cut that last section you read. Again, he says, if there's anyone at all who would challenge it, you can be sure that is owing to a desperate attempt to rationalize certain liberal prejudices. I mean, it's always if you push back, well, you just want to be able to do whatever you want. You want to just be able to do all your sexual disordered things. And
I guess, how do you determine natural law, like what is appropriate, as far as its interpretation versus what actually happens in nature? Like there are animals that use birth control, like damselflies and chickens can reject semen, so they use a form of birth control. And there's all kinds of weird sexual habits in animals, like porcupines can urinate on the females before they have sex. There's like a marsupial that has sex until it dies. I mean, there's all kinds of wild stuff that happens sexually with animals in nature. So how do we know that, we're held to this very high standards, we can only ejaculate in one place?
So to be clear, Phaser would argue something along the lines of what other animals do has no bearing at all on what humans ought to do. We observe humans in nature to discover human nature. Observing what a lion does will tell us about lion nature, but it'll tell us nothing about human nature. Lions might eat their young. I don't remember if that's true, but maybe lions eat their young.
It is true.
Okay, great. Lions eat their young. I remember that correctly. But it would still be wrong for humans to eat our young, even though lions do it, because what is good for lions might not be good for humans.
So if I can reach my penis with my hand, though, what does that say about my arm length? Like I said.
Have you considered shut up? So
my wife is also capable of reaching it, so I don't know.
let me try to, so that I am being funny there. Let me try to put on my kind of like my Thomism hat here. They would say, I think the Thomists would say something along the lines of, well, just because you can do something doesn't mean that that's the nature of the thing. So like, you could use your mouth for grasping things. Like you could, if you wanted to pick up a ball and throw it, you could try to pick it up with your mouth and throw it like that. And it might kind of work, but that doesn't mean that the nature of your mouth is for like grasping and throwing. Your hand might be much better suited for that. And like the way that we would figure this out is by like observing humans in nature, I guess. Right. And just saying like, oh, okay. Like, humans tend to grab things with their hands and not with their mouths. So maybe the hand's purpose is to grab, not the mouth. And so they would look at something like the marital act, and they would be like, oh, like humans are doing this to make more babies. And so the act, like the purpose of this thing is for making more babies. It's not for, I don't know. I mean, insert anything else besides making babies, I guess. That would be the Thomistic response to that. And don't worry, I disagree with it too. And we'll get there. But sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I mean, yeah, we're terrible. We're the terrible alternative side of this conversation because I really have a tough time disagreeing with you. But the one thing that I have really, so what he's talking about here, I don't have it in front of me. 2352. 2352 of the Catechism sounds a lot like that because, they say that's the section on masturbation says both the magisterium of the church in the course of a constant tradition and the moral sense of the faithful have been in no doubt and have firmly maintained that masturbation is an intrinsically gravely and disordered action. That whole, it just, it when you see it, I guess. I don't know.
I thought you would have had that section memorized by now. I'm surprised you had to look.
That part I had to look up. And the other thing I wanted to say is this, and I apologize if we're going to get to it. The really where Phaser in the Thomas lose me isn't so much in this notion about what is natural and unnatural, what's disordered. I'm fine with the idea that based on our biology, et cetera, that the conjugal act, the full open conjugal act is maybe, let's say, the best. That's kind of how we're designed to do. If everything works, that's maybe what we should be doing. But why deviations from that, shortfalls, are not just unnatural, they're like evil, intrinsic. Like this whole moral leap makes no sense to me. And is that something that you're going to cover here? Or?
Right now, your intuition is spot on. Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So hopefully what we just went over with Phaser makes what Pope Pius XII was saying a little bit clearer. When Pope Pius XII was saying that other acts are acts that are not according with the norms defined and imposed by nature itself, are always contrary to nature, this is what he meant. Pope Pius XII is talking about how the telos of the marital act is procreation, and it is contrary to nature in the Aristotelian sense to frustrate the end of that act. So he doesn't mean it's unnatural, it's like supernatural. No, he just means, he doesn't even mean animals don't do this in nature. No. That's not what this means. It's like two different senses of the same word, nature. What he means is that the telos of the act is one such thing, and to do one such thing while not achieving the telos of that thing is kind of like denying the essence of that thing. And so that's not natural in the Aristotelian sense of the term.
Okay.
Hopefully what Pope Pius XII meant by natural, at least, was made clearer by Phaser's explanation in The Last Superstition. But Pope Pius XII didn't only say contrary to nature. He did say contrary to nature, but he didn't only say contrary to nature. He also said intrinsically evil. Yeah. What's the deal with that? Well, instead of looking to Phaser, let's go straight to the man himself, Aquinas. In the second part of the Summa, of course, question 154, article 12, and I can scroll up to the top of this page to show you question 154. It's called the parts of lust. And then you can click on number 12 and it brings you down to article 12, whether the unnatural vice is the greatest sin among the species of lust. So he like lists objections, and then he says, I answer that. And that's where I'm going to start reading. I answer that in every genus, worst of all is the corruption of the principle on which the rest depend. Now, the principles of reason are those things that are according to nature, because a reason presupposes things as determined by nature before disposing of other things according as it is fitting. This may be observed both in speculative and in practical matters. Wherefore, just as in speculative matters, the most grievous and shameful error is that which the things natural, which is naturally bestowed upon man. So in matters of action, you can kind of read that part. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to, it is most grave and shameful to act against things as determined by nature. Therefore, since by the unnatural vices man transgresses that which has been determined by nature with regard to the use of venereal actions, it follows that in this matter, this sin is the gravest of all. After it comes incest, which, as stated above, is contrary to the natural respect which we owe persons related to us. Okay, pause. What did Aquinas just say is worse than incest? The unnatural vices. What's an unnatural vice? So a little bit higher up in the same article, Aquinas defines what an unnatural vice is. And it's really funny because he lumps a whole bunch of different things that all have to do with just acts that mimic the marital act, but there's no chance of procreation occurring. So that's not only solo acts, but it is also acts with animals, and it is also acts with people of the same sex as you. All three of those belong in the same category according to Aquinas. Oh, as well as just regular, plain old heterosexual marital unions in which the ending is not inside. Again, trying to keep things PG. I know I'm
coitus interruptus.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. All of those things are unnatural vice because it is unnatural, not in like the supernatural, but in the like, this is contrary to the nature of the act. So Aquinas continues, with regard to the other species of lust, they imply a transgression merely of that which is determined by right reason on the presupposition, however, of natural principles. So everything else besides the unnatural vices, like at least the nature is like, at least you're not denying the essence of what that act actually is. So, wherefore, simple fornication, which is committed without injustice to another person, is the least grave among the species of lust. Then it is a greater injustice to have intercourse with a woman who is subject to another's authority, as with regards of the act of generation, than as regards merely to her guardianship. So here's that's a little convoluted, but bear with me. It's according to Aquinas, like if two unmarried people got together and no interruptus, not that big of a deal. I mean, it's a sin. It's a sin, but it's the least grave according to Aquinas.
Yeah.
Now, and this is probably even more the case if, for instance, that woman was an orphan or something, because like then you're not stealing like the father's property or anything like that. But if this woman is committed, let's see, if she is subject to another's authority, as with regards to the act of generation, then it's worse than if she's only under another's authority as regards to her guardianship.
Right.
So what does that mean? So like, I guess, a man and an orphan woman, not that big of a deal. A man with a woman who belongs to her father still, because her father is still alive, a little bit of a bigger deal. With a woman who's married to another man, a little bit of a bigger deal. Like it's graduating. And then it becomes worse when it's adultery instead of seduction, meaning like, did you see what she was wearing? If she was asking for it, then it's a little bit less worse than if she wasn't asking for it. And then all of these are aggravated by the use of violence. So
well, at least he's got that part of it going for him.
Well, don't forget that he's listing, and I'm going to use the Latin word for this word right here, raptus. Raptus. Raptus of a virgin is graver than seduction, and raptus of a wife is worse than adultery. And all of these are aggravated when you mix sacrilege in there, but none of them are worse than the corrupting of the principle. So the worst one, worse than raptus, is solo acts and gay acts and acts with animals, which all belong in the same category, I guess. So this is wild, right, to modern audiences. So if I may translate, the least bad sins against the 6 to 9 commandments would be the sins of simple fornication between two unmarried people, as long as it's finishing the right way. And then it gets a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse. Raptus is pretty darn bad, but it's not quite as bad as solo acts. It's not quite as bad as other acts, which would include like a married couple using hands or mouths or something like that. All of that is worse than raptus. That's wild to me. I hope it's wild to everybody in the audience. I
You know,
really hope.
Is there anybody that agrees with Aquinas today?
Yes. Phaser.
Well, I think the church even says Aquinas has this almost level of presumption, like he has high regard, and while they will acknowledge he got a few things wrong, it is, I mean, he's de facto the guy unless there's a really good reason to say he's wrong.
Vita Abscondita in the comments is saying that he's saying that, like, solo acts are intrinsically evil. It is not permissible in any context, just like murder. And like, yeah, I mean, that's the attitude here. It's like, no, like, solo acts and murder, those are all really bad. Those are definitely worse than a raptus, which if you're a normal mental, like well-adjusted person, you're going to think that is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a trad, I mean, if you're not a well-adjusted person, you're not going to think it's that crazy. Sorry, that was mean. I shouldn't have said that.
It's fair.
So hopefully this explains a little bit why Pius XII referred to these kinds of things as intrinsically evil, because they frustrate the nature of the act, and any act that's frustrating its very nature is indeed good. Vita Obscondita says he was responding to a question of another person, so maybe that's not Vita's actual view. And so sorry if it was and I mischaracterized your actual view. Regardless, if it's worse than raptus, like if you said to me, like, do you think that raptus is intrinsically evil? Now, if I was in a philosophical conversation, I might be like, well, as a moral anti-realist, But if you just caught me on the street and you were like, is it? I'd be like, yeah, no, that's intrinsically evil. Like if I was just kind of speaking plainly and not with my philosophy hat on, I'd be like, yeah, raptus is intrinsically evil for sure. And then if you said, what if I told you about something that was even worse than raptus? Wouldn't that be intrinsically evil? I'd be like, heck yeah. And then if you were like, well, solo acts are worse than raptus, therefore they're intrinsically evil, I'd be like, wait, hold on. But you see it like that. It kind of makes sense. Like all of a sudden, Pius XII talking about this being intrinsically evil with all of like Aquinas in mind. Maybe you see where, maybe you don't agree with him. I hope you don't agree with him, but maybe you see where Pius XII is coming from. Let me pause. How am I doing? Am I losing anybody? I'm trying not to be.
Well, it seems to me there is a very definite line of continuation between Aquinas and almost climaxing with Pius XII. I mean,
all right, that'll make for an interesting thumbnail.
I mean, Casti Connubii was a couple decades before, and he really, I think this is like peak scrupulosity nonsense here with Pius XII in this letter. And then it seems like we get this, we kind of finally reach the top, and then it starts coming down with JP2 and Humani Vitae and theology of the body. Because if we're reading Pius XII right, that is in like direct contradiction to what JP2 said and what I think most modern theology of the body people say about these acts. I mean, yeah, it still needs to finish the right way, but I think it's well accepted in Catholic circles now that it's fine to engage in these other acts as long as the conjugal act finishes the correct way. And that would be in direct contradiction to Pius, certainly in direct contradiction to what Conti says that Pius XII meant.
Yeah, I mean, I hope. If we pushed Christopher West, I don't know. I don't know what he would say. If you push any of those like weird terminally online Thomists, like they will straight up tell you, like, of course this is correct. But the weird terminally online Thomists aren't like representative of the theologians at the Vatican and stuff like that. So,
yeah,
take that for whatever it's worth. I guess we'd have to ask Christopher West what he thinks, but I'm not convinced. Yeah, I know. Okay. So let's see. I think at this point I've answered the question as to like, what does Pius XII mean? He says it's against nature. Also, it's intrinsically evil. We looked at phaser in particular. We were looking at the last superstition. for why it's unnatural. And then we went straight to the Summa with the second part, question 154, Article 12, for why it's intrinsically evil. With that kind of primer out of the way, geez, I know, a 40-minute primer. I'm sorry, guys. I think it's time for me to actually start telling you why I disagree with all of this, right? So I actually just disagree that natural law is like veridical in the first place. And again, I'm knocking the blocks over. I'm not going to clean them up. To knock over this tower properly, I'm going to explain why I think that natural law fails as an ethical theory. But first, I'm actually going to explain why I think it fails as a physical theory. I don't actually expect a whole lot of pushback on its failing as a physical theory, which is nice, right? Points of agreement are always nice. But then I'm going to go on to explain why I think it fails as an ethical theory, and you should see some like themes returning from the physical theory. And I think it also kind of just adds a little bit of like historical insight that I don't think a lot of scholastic types really talk about. Let's move on. So we're going to start with why natural law fails by my lights as a physical theory. Mm-hmm. Not too long ago, I was watching a science fiction show on Netflix called the three body problem. And there's this really funny clip that I actually clipped in a recent video of mine. I hope that the audio comes through for you guys. It's only about 5 seconds long. I'm going to hit play and a clip from the three body problem is going to play. Let's see if it works.
Nope. I don't have audio.
Did you get audio?
No.
No audio? All right. Well, in this clip, there's and you know, it kind of, so there's, I'll have to just kind of like walk you through. So see this guy on the screen right here. He's actually a good actor. He was in Game of Thrones and stuff. I forget his name. But he says, Aristotle actually thought, and then he says something profound and philosophical. And by the way, he's like a military guy. And then this woman is like a theoretical physicist or something. And she quips back saying, yeah, well, Aristotle thought that rocks fell because they love the ground. And I just think that's funny.
Yeah.
It's not actually accurate. Like if you read Aristotle, he doesn't say that rocks fall because they love the ground, but it's a funny clip. So I figured I would play it. We'll get over here in a second. Okay. But yeah, Aristotle never actually says that rocks fall because they love the ground. But if we just kind of squint a little bit, it kind of looks like that. So this sci-fi show, it is fiction. So, okay, I'll forgive the philosophical mistake that they made in the show, but it's not entirely false. Mm-hmm. Okay. In order to talk about Aristotelian physics, I think that we should first start by saying that Aristotle didn't do experimentation. He wrote a book called Physics. And you always hear all these philosophers throwing out these big words like metaphysics. Metaphysics literally just means after physics, because Aristotle wrote a book and he called it Physics, and he wrote another book after that and he called it After Physics. Metaphysics. That's it. That's where it comes from. But Aristotle's physics is not like the physics that we understand it today. Aristotle was trying to come to conclusions about the physical world using processes that we would probably label philosophy today. Mm-hmm. And philosophy is not a super useful tool for coming up with beliefs about the physical world. Experimenting and repeating your experiments is generally how we come up with beliefs about the physical world today. And Aristotle didn't do that. And this isn't controversial, what I'm saying either. To back up this point about Aristotle's physics and how his physics is really more of a philosophy and less of a physics, we're going to look at Aristotle's Physics, A Physicist's Look, which is a 2014 article on the screen now. This paper is actually kind of cool because it tries to defend Aristotle a little bit. It kind of says that, like, hey, look, Aristotle was wrong about a lot of things, but we shouldn't be so hard on him. After all, says the author, Einstein proved Newton wrong, but we still appreciate Newtonian physics. I mean, everybody learns Newtonian. Oh, by the way, I should say, I'm a chemical engineer by education. So like I'm into this science stuff. And so if I lose you, I'm sorry, ask questions, interrupt me, all that good stuff. But in like high school and stuff, you're going to learn Newtonian physics, even though it's not correct. Mm-hmm. Like if you try to plot the movement of planets around the sun with Newtonian physics, you'll be close, but it'll be off. and Einstein's physics fixes Newtonian physics. But generally, people today think of Newton as like a brilliant mind who we appreciate, who we learn about in school, and nobody really feels that way about Aristotle, despite the fact that Aristotle's physics actually lasted up until about Newton. So for over 1,000 years, Aristotle's physics worked all right. And the author of this article is kind of trying to argue that even though he was wrong, he was right on the surface of planet Earth for normal daily interactions, and it was close enough that it worked for over 1,000 years. So we should appreciate him. That's what this article is really saying. But I would like to read the opening section of this paper. Aristotle's physics does not enjoy good press. It is commonly called intuitive and at the same time blatantly wrong. For instance, it is commonly said to state that heavier objects fall faster when every high school kid should know that they fall at the same speed. Science, we also read, began only by escaping the Aristotelian straitjacket and learning to rely on observation. Aristotelian physics is not even included among the numerous entries of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy devoted to Aristotle. So, man, that's rough. To be sure, there are also less hostile and more sympathetic accounts of Aristotle's views on nature, change, and motion, and the historical importance of these views is recognized. But here's a common example of evaluation. This is rough. Traditionally, scholars have found the notion notion congenial that Aristotle's intended method in his works on natural science is empirical, even as they have criticized him for failures on this count. The current generation has reversed this verdict entirely. The physics in particular is now standardly taken as a paradigm of Aristotle's use of the dialectical method, understood largely as conceptual or a priori. So if it's a priori, that means that Aristotle's science is either not science at all, or to the extent that it is a science, it's a failure. That's how that first paragraph ends. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty rough on Aristotle's science. This paper then goes on to outline some of Aristotle's failures. On page 2, the author outlines Aristotle's views on motion. You can see here that Aristotle actually had two different views of motion. There's natural motion and there's unnatural motion or violent motion. So two different kinds of motion. So like imagine like you were taking a science test and somebody said, like, when you throw a ball, is that an example of natural motion or violent motion? You'd be like, what? Like, that's just not part of the scientific landscape today. Like, we just don't talk about two different kinds of motion because modern physics has no such theory of violent motion versus natural motion. Another thing is that Aristotle thought that when the speed at which an object falls is proportionate to the weight of the object as well as the density of the medium in which the object is falling. So there's a little bit of math on this page. Don't worry, we're not going to go into it. But that's roughly how Aristotle would have thought about objects falling. And we know that that's not the case. And that's really evident because according to Aristotle's math, if an object was falling in a perfect void, its speed would reach infinity. Right? Because if the density of the medium through which the object is falling is 0, then the speed at which that object is falling is going to reach infinity. Thus, Aristotle concluded that void does not exist. He actually wrote this in physics. There are no voids because it's impossible for anything to fall infinitely fast. We know that this is wrong. In fact, an object in a perfect void would be motionless because there's no other objects to attract it to. And if it was moving in a perfect void somehow, it would stay moving because an object in motion stays in motion until it's acted upon by another force. Aristotle didn't know any of this. And so his physics is just wrong. And I think that's enough examples. I'm not going to spend I'm already waxing poetic about this stuff. So I'm not going to keep on going with the examples because we all agree already. Aristotle's physics was not accurate. That is why, even though Aristotle proposed two different kinds of motion, since modern physics doesn't have any need of two different kinds of motion, we've all stopped believing in two different kinds of motion. And even though Aristotle proposed 4 different kinds of causes, since modern physics doesn't have any need of 4 different kinds of causes, we've all stopped believing in 4 different kinds of causes. Except we haven't. We haven't stopped believing in 4 different kinds of causes. I mean, most of us have. But Catholics, at least the more Orthodox Catholics, have not. they still hold to Aristotelian causation, particularly that fourth and final cause, the teleology. Catholics think that final causation is an accurate way to explain the world, though perhaps not the physical world. Catholics will gladly admit. They'll argue that teleology explains the metaphysical world, the ethical world, and I am getting really bad feedback. I don't know if anybody in the audience is getting that too, but
You were breaking up a little bit on our end. I'm not sure what that was.
All right, I'll keep going. So Catholics will say that metaphysics is not physics after all, but I find this kind of odd. Imagine someone forwarded the argument that, sure, Aristotle's description of motion doesn't describe the physical world of motion, but it describes metamotion, the motion of maybe one substance or one essence into another. So maybe like transubstantiation, right? Substances transubstantiating. Maybe that's violent motion as opposed to like natural motion or something like that. When I just said that right now, when I was describing metamotion as opposed to like, metaphysics, the hairs on the back of Ed Fazer's neck stood up because what I said right there is nonsense. We do not use violent motion and natural motion to describe anything, not in the physical world and not in the metaphysical world. With good reason, too. We shouldn't be using violent motion or natural motion to explain anything because we don't need it. But for some reason, Catholics are holding on to Aristotelian causation still. When I was a trad, talking about final ends seemed natural to me because I kind of just grew up hearing that things have purposes, like things have like teloi or teloi, or I don't know, I don't speak Greek, but that all seemed natural to me. But today, speaking about telos and teleology is about as alien to me as talking about violent motion or natural motion. And it's not just me. The entire scientific community agrees with that assessment. Okay. I think I'm done talking about why Aristotelian physics fails as a physical theory. We've all agreed that it fails as a physical theory. Anyway, we've all agreed about this since Sir Isaac Newton. So it's been hundreds and hundreds of years. So let's move on. Let's talk about why natural law fails even as an ethical theory. All right. So even though I clearly do not grant that final causation is a real thing that somehow accurately describes the world, for the sake of the rest of my little presentation today, I'm going to grant that like natural law really does describe the world in some kind of veridical sense. The first reason why I think that natural law still fails as an ethical theory is kind of related in some ways as to why it fails as a physical theory. And that's because of the non-empirical nature of these final ends, something that all natural law proponents will admit to, by the way. No proponent of natural law theory thinks that like you'll be able to find a telos under a microscope or anything like that. But these abstracta, having knowledge of abstracta seems to be either incredibly difficult or straight up impossible. Final causes, since they do not fall into the physical realm, would be considered abstract objects, and all abstract objects are causally inert. This is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, by the way. It's an article called Nominalism in Metaphysics, written by, I believe this is by Tim O'Connor. It might be at the end. But regardless, there's an important part that I want to quote right here. You can read the whole article. I'm not going to for the sake of time, but if these objects really are causally inert, then they can't seem to ever have caused anything that would cause 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 somebody to come to knowledge of them. If that does work, then there is an explanatory lacuna in Platonism. This also works for Aristotelian, moderate realism. But as long as you believe that these abstract objects really do exist in some kind of vertical sense, then I'm going to challenge you to explain the explanatory lacuna. And lacuna is just a word that means like an unexplained portion. So how the heck is it even possible that anybody comes to knowledge of these abstracta if they're causally inert? If nothing can cause that thing to cause me to become aware of it, like the only reason I'm aware of this cup of water right here is because there is a light that is bouncing off of it, that is bouncing into my eyes, and it's causing me to become aware of it. Like, there is a chain of causal events, but these causally inert abstracta, we cannot possibly come to knowledge of them. By my lights, I have no idea how we could possibly come to knowledge about them. And this appears to be a well understood problem, even for the fiercest proponents of realism. Dr. David Oderberg wrote what is perhaps like the book on realism. It's called Real Essentialism. And shoot, where was I? Let's go back. I think it was like 261 or something like that. And so Real Essentialism, I actually have a funny story about that. When I was like kind of first exploring this stuff, I guess this was a while ago, I called Catholic Answers. And Catholic Answers told me to read this book. I was asking them about like transubstantiation and stuff like that. I'll admit that I haven't read it cover to cover. But I'm about to quote from it to kind of back up my point. So here it is. Oderberg admits, apparent vagueness in species must be taken seriously as a metaphysical issue, just as in other areas. I do not propose to offer a solution to the problem of vagueness here. Let me zoom in. It is not clear whether there is a single solution to all the different sorts of case vagueness can throw up, or even if there is a single solution, it is not clear whether there might be a single method for handling vagueness in every area, even though we might be able to enunciate some principles that govern all cases. Vagueness seems to infect everything: accidents, properties, substances, essences, and other kinds of things such as collections and aggregates, laws, parts, causes, languages, and so on, throughout ontology, language, thought, and reasoning. Specifically here, Oderberg is talking about vagueness in species, like where do we draw the line, like when one species turns into a different species through evolution. But this really does apply to everything. It applies to all causally inert things. And Oderberg admits that there's a problem. And don't get me wrong, go ahead, read Real Essentialism. He does go on to propose some things that he thinks helps with the vagueness, but he admits that like there's no easy solution here, and that vagueness seems to be a real problem. This vagueness in what abstracta even are seems pretty problematic by my lights for anyone who hopes to use natural law as an ethical theory. For example, the person who wants to use natural law might want to say that the form of like man, like mankind, has the telos of like to procreate, for instance. Therefore, like gay relationships might be immoral because they're not procreating. There's a good book though that I'm going to pull up, and this book is on Kindle, so you'll have to give me 1 second. While I'm pulling it up, Craig and Jonah, I've been talking for a long time. Am I losing anybody?
No, I think I'm tracking, and I have a few questions that I'm gonna follow up with when you're done here.
Okay, I'm getting close to the end for why I think that natural law theory fails as an ethical theory. But there's this book by Gunther Laird called The Unnecessary Science. And in this book, Laird proposes the idea that perhaps it is possible that gay men instantiate a separate form and thus possess a different final cause than straight men, meaning that sodomy is not necessarily a contravention of the purpose of their sexual faculties. Later in that same chapter, Gunther Laird writes, if gay people have their own particular form, it also stands to reason that what is good for them may be different than what is good for heterosexual people. After all, the good in the sense of fulfilling one's function is different for creatures with different forms. To reuse Phaser's favorite example, it is good for a squirrel to scamper up trees and eat nuts, but it would starve if it tried to visit many flowers and eat pollen. A bee, on the other hand, is a good bee to the extent that it visits flowers and gathers pollen, and a bad, sickly bee if it buzzes around all day attempting to bring nuts larger than it is back to the hive. And then this part, what he's saying is, it is good for people like Phaser, given his 6 children, for him to make 6 children. But why are we so certain that the form of the heterosexual is the same as the form of the gay man? And how do we know that? I'm going to argue that it is literally impossible for us to know this because of the causal inertness of abstracta. I think that is a massive, massive problem. Now, I can already hear the Thomists scoffing at me. There's no such thing as the form of a gay man, just the form of man. I can't believe that you would even suggest a thing, Kevin. This is not based at all. Well, let's keep reading. Gunther Laird suggests that, and this is really interesting, if you can tell the difference between things, then Aristotle would actually say that those things have separate forms. Because if 2 things have the exact same form, then there's just like no difference between what those things are. But the act of delineating them means that they should actually have separate forms. And so, at least all this would be so if homosexuals truly did instantiate their own forms, but perhaps they don't. Isn't homosexuality merely a behavior or a preference for a certain behavior? We wouldn't say that people who simply do different things or partake in different hobbies have different forms. Like, we wouldn't say that people who enjoy baseball and who enjoy football are football fans or baseball fans, right? Like, we wouldn't say that they have different forms. Well, actually, we would, and we should, as the very existence of those 2 terms attest. If forms really do exist, as Fazer and his natural law friends would say, then anything that exists and can be distinguished in any way from any other existing thing has a form. Given that there is clearly some difference between football fans and baseball fans, they must instantiate a different form in some way. This would remain the case, at least according to David Oderberg, even if there were some kind of vagueness in definitions, such as how one could be a fan of both football and baseball. So I think that this is fatal to natural law theory, the inability to actually determine with any kind of certainty what the form of literally anything is. Like, this seems absolutely fatal to natural law. What do you think about that?
All right, everybody go home.
We've solved it.
We've solved that problem. Let's go on to another one. Well, so I've always wondered, when we talk about natural law in sort of this moral context, are they contending that this is something that you can see independent of any sort of divine revelation, scripture? Like, this is something that is innate to us, and even the atheists should be able to see and perceive of these moral standards. Is that what they contend?
Oh, yeah. Let's not forget that Fazer calls this blindingly obvious. See that right there? Blindingly obvious. You don't need Darwinism or Aristotelianism for that matter to tell you this. It is, I dare say, blindingly obvious. And if there is anyone at all who would challenge it, you can be sure that it is owing to a desperate attempt to rationalize certain liberal, and he spits the word out, you can tell, prejudices by keeping the natural law theorists from getting out the starting gate.
I mean, what a cop out. I mean, it's obvious to anyone who's got sense, and if it's not obvious to you, obviously you don't have sense. Like, it's just like, how do we even respond to that?
And I think that's the problem, is that so I don't think that Ed Fazer is free to disagree with Aquinas, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that Fazer's an apologist, and I think that he is doing the typical apologist thing here, and he's not as concerned with the truth as he is with, like, kind of backing up what he already believes.
Well,
and again, this is really uncharitable of me to just kind of like psychologize him. And I can't know his mind or his heart, obviously. But it seems to me like Fazer is hell-bent on making sure that anybody who disagrees with him is just a liberal, like it's
I think the problem is that this natural law is so, and Aristotle, Aquinas, is so baked into
our traditions and our moral values that we've had for so long. And when you start using the term intrinsic evil, like we've been teaching for hundreds of years that people are going to hell for these things. Like, I don't know how you, oops,
Too late to turn back
like
now.
you there's no way out of that other than, I think if you try to separate yourself from that, the whole thing crumbles. And I think that, whether he admits it or not, and maybe, I mean, I think he would just say, yeah, if we believe what we believe as Catholics, then we have to find a way to reconcile Aristotle, the natural law, and all these things, because this is tradition and we're required to believe these. And so I can't not believe that. So here's my best effort to try and make sense of it. And I get it. Like, and it makes me uneasy too, because I don't know what that looks like. But I agree with you. I don't know how I don't know how we can just ignore the fact that so much of this is built on Aristotle and Aquinas, who clearly, I don't think they had this right. I think they had some major errors in it. And maybe they did good for their time, but we now know they got these things wrong.
Mm-hmm.
No disagreements here, and this goes back to the part where I said I'm going to knock down, I'm smashing your Lego tower or whatever. I can't really help you put it back together, and the putting it back together. So I don't know. Can you see all the chats in like my chat and your chat? Are they combined?
Yes.
So my friend CJ, his Aristo, said, "Is Catholic tradition reformable?" And I think that's a really excellent question, because it depends who you ask, right? I mean, I think if you ask a lot of like the kind of if you ask theologians of the Vatican II persuasion, the von Belshazzars, right? There you go. Awesome. Thank you. I think the answer there is like absolutely yes. But then if you talk to insert terminally online Thomists today, they'll say no. And who do we trust? Like, von Belshazzar or some radically, terminally online Thomist? Well, that's up to you to decide, I guess. But it seems like it depends who you ask if Catholic tradition is reformable or not. And if you are like me, where when you were Catholic, you did think that it's like not really reformable, it kind of makes it brittle in the sense that one thing cracks and you're like, oh, well, I guess that show's over. Like, let's not even be Catholic anymore. And I mean, that is what happened to me. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I am saying that it is more brittle. Does that make sense?
It is. It is not very agile for these kinds of circumstances. And I don't know that. I mean, I think guys like Phaser, as confident as they are in their views, let's assume he believes everything with as much confidence as he writes. I don't know how they can't acknowledge the dilemma and the struggle that people have. And I'm a Catholic, like I'm on the inside still struggling with these things. And I don't think I'm any of these things he says. I think I'm acting in good faith. I'm trying to be a good Catholic, but I don't think these things are blindingly obvious, like he says. And when he says this is blindingly obvious, and my thought is, okay, what else do you have wrong, Phaser? What else does Aquinas have wrong? Like, when you're gonna dig your heels in there, okay, well, I'm calling your bluff. What else you got wrong?
I mean, that's exactly what happened to me. So for me, the first thing that happened to me was like I realized that I didn't think that like being gay was this like intrinsically evil thing. I didn't think it was a sin that cried out to heaven for vengeance. And I was like, wait a minute, but the church clearly has good reason for teaching this, so let me dive into it.
Mm-hmm.
And I did, and I realized I'm like, I don't think the church does have good reasons for believing this. But I was so certain that the church did that it made me go, wait a minute, maybe I should go and analyze all the other things that I was so certain about. And I didn't. And I realized that I didn't personally, and I'm not saying that every Catholic is like this, but I personally didn't have enough confidence in all of the other claims as well to keep calling myself Catholic. So I said, okay, then I'm not Catholic anymore. So be it. And And I kind of went back to the drawing board, and now I like to think that I only believe things that I have like good reason to believe. But everybody believes that, obviously, right? All the time. Like if you ask me while I was still Catholic if I have good reasons for being Catholic, I say, of course I do. But I guess when I actually sat down and I like started doing the actual homework, I was like, oh shoot, like I actually have no idea what I'm talking about. You know? And I still have no idea what I'm talking about. And if I may soapbox a little bit, it really, really grinds my gears when I see other people who, so I know that I know nothing, but then I meet practicing Catholics who I can tell don't know as much as I do. But those people are willing to, they're trying to make gay marriage illegal again. And that makes me very, very angry because I know that I know nothing. And I know that you know less than me. And you're trying to make gay marriage illegal. You're trying to take rights away from people. And if we debated natural law, I would win. And again, debates aren't about winning and losing, but it really, really bothers me slavery bothers me, right? That's not accurate. It's not intense enough language. But I am disgusted and repulsed by people who try to make gay marriage illegal and they've never picked up the Summa. They've never read any Phaser. They've never read any Oderberg, nothing. They just, oh, yuck, it's gross. And then they vote to make it illegal. I'm disgusted by that.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Joe.
No, I just had a question about the previous screen where you're reading from. I was just reading it when the screens changed. I think the previous one.
Go up a little bit. Stop me if you see it.
It had to do with, I think it might have been a different page, but it was something about, talking about nocturnal emissions as it relates to like natural law or how like that.
That would have been the Summa.
No, I don't think it was that one either. But
nocturnal pollution? Is it over here?
No, I can't remember where it was. It's gone now, but
all right,
it was just an interesting statement because it was, I'm sorry. I can't remember what it even said, but it caught my eye.
Okay.
If you remember what it was, I'd be very happy to go back. I saw one question that I think is interesting and I can kind of talk a little bit about. It was about murder and like if it's good for a murderer to murder. Let me see if I can find the comment. Give me 1 second. Let's see. It's going to be up a little bit. Oh, perfect. A murderer's form would promote killing as good? ? That is an excellent question. So, I did have a little bit left in my presentation that I just kind of opted not to do because it's kind of neither here nor there, but it has to do with this this point. So, Phaser wrote a different book. So this isn't The Last Superstition anymore. This is called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. And this comes from chapter 5. And if I go back up to page 153, which is right here, Phaser talks about, and let's see, it's possible that I'm not including. So in this book, Phaser talks about a triangle, and a triangle having straight sides is like very important to its triangular nature. And so we would talk about a triangle having like curved sides as like a bad triangle, but that doesn't have to, here it is. The standard in question, the standard of being a triangle, is not a standard of moral goodness, but it does illustrate the general notion of goodness from which moral goodness is a special case. So in that sense, the form of a murderer is like somebody who murders. So it is actually good for murderers to murder. If you don't murder anybody, then you're a really bad murderer. And again, that's not a moral statement. That's just a like fact of the universe, as Phaser would say.
It-
And I think this has interesting implications for procreation. Can you kind of imagine where I'm going with this?
Well, it seems like it's sort of the flip side of the coin of this idea that solo is the worst because it's violating the form of the act, when clearly that doesn't make sense. But that's what he says. It seems like the opposite side of that coin.
What it seems like to me is this. Just as not murdering anybody makes you a really bad murderer,
Mhm.
Solo acts make you a really bad procreator.
Hmm.
So what?
Yeah.
So what? So what? And guess what? Other acts with your hetero spouse
Mhm.
make you really bad at procreating. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe if you're also, if you have 9 kids.
Well, if you're bad enough at the other acts, you might have kids anyway.
True.
Although solo activity could produce better sperm as opposed to holding on to all these old sperm cells. So it might not be that counteractive, I guess.
You would love The Unnecessary Science by Gunther Laird, the one book that we looked at, because Gunther Laird proposes that exact argument that also there's all these weird things about how human biology really makes it seem such that every male is supposed to be getting as many females as that male can possibly get pregnant all the time.
Mhm.
Like there's nothing about our biology that suggests that like men should like, only get one woman pregnant and then wait for 10 months and then do it again and then wait for 10 months. No.
Yeah.
Our biology is not like that.
Yeah.
It's not like our organs like shut down once they've detected a woman with a high hormone level or whatever. And then they're like, okay, wait for 10 months and then go again. No.
Yeah,
So
we
the
got that.
teleology.
Well,
So-
is teleology of this stuff unaffected by original sin? Like that's what I don't understand when they say let's look at nature, but the stuff they can't seem to make sense of. They say, well, that's just concupiscence. That's not the way it was originally. Like,
But nobody can know that.
no.
I'm not going to like super wade into the original sin thing only because it kind like Aristotle had a ethic that was pretty much based on natural law. And by the way, I think that Aristotle's ethic is actually kind of okay. And if you ask me where the problem, so like natural law, like if you're just asking me like, well, doesn't it make sense that like solo acts are bad for procreation? Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course that makes sense. Like I'm not denying that solo acts are bad for procreation in the same way that I'm not going to deny that not murdering people makes you a bad murderer.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
of course, but these are just word games at this point. And it's the Aristotelian ethic is kind of just that. It's like, so Aristotle would say that like man's nature is like such that we want to attain certain virtues. So like one of our like virtues that it's within our nature to obtain would be like wisdom. So like when a man gathers wisdom, he's actually doing something that is good for man. And when he does something that's going to make him like not be very wise, it's like bad for man. So like that's what Aristotle would say. But that's not exactly what the Thomist will say. The Thomist is going to go on and kind of talk about, well, we don't care about what's good for triangularity or what's good for being a murderer, right? Like we don't really care about those things. Like there's nothing moral about a good triangle. There's nothing immoral about a bad triangle. So what is it that actually like bestows morality upon like actions? Well, says the Thomist, humans actually have one telos, and that one telos is what kind of drives everything. And that is to know, love, and serve God in this life so that we could be with him in the next. So anything that you do that furthers that end is good, and anything that you do that doesn't further that end is bad. And guess what? Like solo acts and things like that are going to keep you from knowing, loving, and serving God in this life so that you could be with him in the next. That's why it's bad. But if you ask me, that's just divine command theory. Like that's not different than divine command theory. So if at the end of the day, natural law theory just turns into divine command theory, I still think it fails as an ethical theory because it's just divine command theory, like with a toga on. Like it's divine command theory that went to Athens, and
it's often felt to me like this natural law stuff is I know we've talked about this too, is like it really seems to come after you form the conclusion that you want. Now hey, here's another reason why this makes sense. And I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this stuff all came from the 38th chapter of Genesis and Onan, and now, people became squeamish about that thing. Well, here's another reason why that all makes sense. So here's natural law.
The guy died.
Yeah. It's got to be a good reason for it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that comes from just like a misreading of the Onan story, frankly. But
yeah, but it's, again, it seems like it was so far down the track before anyone stopped to like ask, hey, does this make sense? Like, you just couldn't reverse course. I just think we should be, really, more than anything, I just want people to be honest about it and say, look, what we're really doing here is we're basing this on, a combination of scripture and divine whatever, and then we're just kind of like, I think it almost detracts from it to try and bring in this natural law, as opposed to just saying, no, we follow scripture, we believe Onan got killed, this is why, let's just own it, and let's own it, and I mean, I wouldn't find that compelling, but it would, at least it'd be honest, I guess. And
yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I sympathize with those who want to marry natural law into religion, because they think that, like, they have some kind of like desire for this all to be very rational and logical and make sense and all that. And like, me too, man, me too.
I think it's the OCD in all of us that want order. It's sort of like, you have the 10 commandments, and I think that gives us a general guidepost, but that doesn't cover everything. And I think people want order. Some people want order for the sake of order, and they want, and they want that in their life. And this is their way of kind of filling in the blanks and just tell me what I got to do. So this tells me what I got to do, and I don't have to think about it. I don't have to wrestle with things. And then it gets creeped in by the OCD types, and then it just becomes the law, and then you're stuck with it, really, unless someone's really willing to fall on their sword and look silly.
Yeah. Can I rephrase some people just want order for the sake of order kind of thing? Because I think I can almost be more charitable to the Thomists in a way. Because like, in this sense, like, I'm right there with them. I don't think that they want order for the sake of order. I think that they only want to believe things that they have good reason for believing. But they're committed to believing in certain things through scripture.
Yeah.
And they might, in the back of their mind, and I felt this way too, think that scripture alone is really not.
Yeah.
Like, if there was a scripture that said, like, actually everybody should murder their firstborn child or something like that. Like, you'd probably be like, wait, no, hold on, I disagree with that. And like, but why? If I told you that it was in scripture, well, maybe because, like, subconsciously, at least, you think that scripture alone isn't really a good reason to believe something. And so then those people seek natural law as something beyond scripture to kind of back up scripture almost. And like, yeah, man, me too. Like, I get it. I do. So yeah, instead of calling it order for the sake of order, I'm going to say that I think that this comes from a place of wanting to have more reasons to believe stuff that they find in scripture, but scripture alone isn't good enough.
Well, and I think, not to pick on Phaser too much, but I think, this whole instinct thing, like, there are certain things that just seem wrong, like just intuitively seem wrong. You can think of some extreme examples, and I think sometimes we wonder, well, why is that? Like, there must be some reason why we humans can tell that it's wrong to murder someone, or it's wrong to do this and that. And natural law sort of provided that, I don't know, foundation for those instincts that I think we most of us have. It's just, I don't know, the further you get away from that kind of stuff, and the more you get into this stuff between married people, is like, I don't know. I just don't know that it's self-obvious.
Yeah, who felt bad about going solo back at that time? Like, were they just wasting their time? Is that what they really felt bad about?
Yeah.
I can't tell you. I didn't live back then.
You're not helping. And I think, and I think that
I don't think guys that, well, let's just say guys and gals, let's say guys that do that, I think for the most part, if given the choice, would much rather be with their spouse. So it's
Oh, for
not,
sure.
so, I just think I think there's evidence sort of in our experiences that sort of line up with this stuff. But when you really start to shine a light on it, natural law doesn't really, it kind of fails as a complete system for understanding why we kind of have these natural feelings about things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I don't think that natural law is so I don't think it's veridical. And even if it was veridical, I don't think I would feel comfortable using it as an ethical theory.
I did have one thing I wanted to talk about Pius XII again, if we can
Let's do
circle
it.
back on that. So, and I read Conti's commentary, even though we didn't put it up on the screen.
I have it up if you want me to
Yeah,
pull it up.
can you want to do that? Because let me throw it on the screen here.
Like this in particular, is this what you're because this is so bad.
Yeah, I mean, so for those that are maybe listening, the teaching, and he's commenting on what Pius XII wrote, right? That's what he's writing here. This is his commentary. This teaching absolutely condemns as intrinsically evil and gravely immoral the idea, promoted loudly and incessantly by many Catholic commentators, that the wife may climax before or after the natural marital act by the use of unnatural sexual acts to completion. The Holy Pontiff teaches that neither the husband nor the wife may deliberately choose, quote, or parentheses, directly intend the full exercise of the sexual faculty outside of the natural act. That, I mean, that's a very extreme reading of what Pius XII said there. But there are people that hold that, but that is definitely different. That is different from, I would say, the mainstream post-Vatican II, post-Humanae Vitae, Christopher West of the world.
And I feel bad for their wives.
Yeah.
I doubt that people like this are married. But
yeah.
But yeah, if they are, then I do feel bad for their wives. So I agree with you that this is like nuts. But I also kind of think it's an accurate reading of Pius XII. And the reason I say that is because Pius XII does say, so I guess the first thing that we need to consider is what does the full exercise of the sexual faculty mean? Like, does that only mean like men? Or is it also referring to women? And then I think to inform that answer, we can look at that second paragraph where he says, whether the full exercise of the genital organs is done by the man or the woman or by both parties together, whether it's done by manual touches or the interruption of the conjugal act. The manual touches here to me, like, ooh, the manual touches are intrinsically evil too? Like,
I was going to ask, is he allowed foreplay or not? You just, like...
Got to mount up.
Jeepers Christmas. Like, I don't know how you do it, quite frankly.
I like, while I was kind of preparing for today's stream, I looked up, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't have it at my fingertips, but there was a like a survey. It was a scientific study that was published in like 2014 or 15 or so. And there was a survey that went out to women, and it's just, hey, do you climax from PIV alone?
Mm-hmm.
And it was slightly above 80% said no.
Mm-hmm.
And so those poor 81% of women or whatever would literally never get to climax if this was the case. And that sucks.
And they probably have less sex and less kids overall.
Probably.
Well, that's why you gotta have the marital debt. If you're following this, you pretty much gotta have some dick you can
I mean,
yeah.
All of a sudden the marital debt is kind of like, oh, that's why we have
that's
it,
why
right?
we have that. Yeah.
You know, we needed to convince women that if they were withholding the marital debt, then they were committing a mortal sin. And
you
know,
I mean,
it gets ugly pretty quick.
Yeah.
This now, for those that are still listening, or ever do listen to this, this Pius. So this is a letter or an address. So this is not an encyclical. It's not I don't think it's authoritative. The church had plenty of opportunities to cite this in like Humani Vitae and Vatican II and didn't do so. So I don't think this is binding, but I'm sure what you're going to say, Kevin, and I agree is, well, this is still a pope applying Aristotelian Thomistic natural law to it, kind of taking it to its logical extremes. And I agree, that's the problem. Like if you apply that to this extreme, this is what you end up with.
Yeah. So not only like you're right that so the context of this was it was a speech that Pope Pius XII gave at the Second World Congress on Fertility and Sterility, which was something that took place in 1956, I want to say, right? Yeah, 56. So it wasn't even a like encyclical or anything like that. But
it's been a tough crowd. Like I just can't imagine sitting through this. But it seems to me this you know what this looks like to me? This looks like post Casti Connubii. You know, with Pius XI did that, no birth control people, and Catholics were looking for a loophole, and probably started doing this stuff. And Pope Pius heard about it. Amplified activity. And he's like, hold on, we can't have this. You know, like it just seems like it's like
keep your hands to yourself.
All right, you guys couldn't just behave yourself. Now we're really gonna crack the whip on you.
Yeah. Something I will say that might be like disturbing for some types of Catholics would be what Pope Pius XII said here. Yes, it's not published in an encyclical or a bull or anything like that, but it is in line with 1,000 years of church tradition, 1,000+ years of church tradition. And so I grew up believing that like the ordinary magisterium, when it taught something repeatedly over the course of hundreds of years, and it like repeated it throughout the centuries, and it was a matter of faith or morals, that was infallible, and you can't go back on that. This is certainly a matter of morals, right? Intrinsic evil and whatnot. And it appears to be taught, you know, so when was Aquinas? The 13th century, right? And then the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And it was taught every century in between. And if that's the case, and if you're the kind of Catholic who's really worried about church tradition, and then you start reading theology of the body and like the other Vatican II kind of stuff, you're like, oh, whoa, hold on. This is not in line with church tradition. You know, and then Lafarge breaks away and the SSVX is born, and you know, here we are today. No, but I mean, it kind of, I get it. I do. Like I'm funny because I'm not Catholic, like at all. But man, do I get the trads, because I was one. And sometimes I think like, man, if I was Catholic, like I feel like I'd fall right back into my trad kind of ways, because some of their cases are pretty compelling. And this is one of them, like where it is the tradition for hundreds of years. Well,
and that's why the more and more I encounter trads online, they all consistently seem to be NFP is bad.
Yep.
We're just going to have as many kids as we can. The marital debt is fine. None of this, you know, I mean, that's how they do it. And I get it. Like, I guess you almost have to approach it that way if you're going to make sense of this stuff and the stuff that came 1,000 years before it. But that, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think there's a reason why when they had the opportunity to do so, they pivoted and at least try to go in a different direction with theology of the body, Humani Vitae, and tried to put a more positive theological spin on it. And that's got its own host of problems. You know, they try to romanticize the marital act too much, I think. But
I agree that the romanticization of the marital act is kind of like, I don't know. It seems weird to me. But again, I'm like weirdly trad leaning. So like, you know, of course I'm going to see it weird, right? That's not surprising. I do want to say that I'm happy to take audience questions or questions from you guys if you guys like wanted to kind of push back on anything that I said, or if anybody in the audience wants to push back on things I said. I'm good to hang out for another like 30 minutes or something if we wanted to do 30 minutes full of conversation. But if we didn't want to and we wanted to kind of wrap it up sooner rather than later, I'm totally fine with that too.
Well, I'm fine with questions. I did want to make one point here. I don't know if it's going to come out as a question or a point. I guess we'll find out when I'm done. But one of the things I came in struggling with, and this is really more, I would say, the theology, the body types who have tried to kind of reconcile this, Pius XII, in more or less. And I actually have a podcast that came out this morning from a Christopher West protege, talking about oral stimulation, for example, is fine for the man and the woman as long as it is part of a conjugal act. For the wife, it can take place independently before or after. For the man, it has to happen during intercourse itself. So they're trying to mix and apply this stuff to a little liberalized standard. But to me, and still say it's intrinsically evil, for example, for a couple to do those things if the conjugal act isn't planned and isn't intended. One of the problems that I have with that whole notion is saying that's intrinsically evil is here you've got a couple. Let's say this is how they go through the process. They get together, you start to hold each other, you start touching, you start getting aroused. If you apply them, maybe the man arouses his wife to climax prior to any intercourse itself. There's nothing, it can't be intrinsically evil if you can do it within the context of, this is followed by the conjugal act. It only becomes evil if the intention is not to go to the conjugal act. And I don't know how it could be intrinsically evil because the act itself depends on the circumstances and the intentions of the parties. At least I think that's correctly applying what I would say is the current theology, the body context. I think it's really problematic to apply these standards to, especially to the female. What we know about her anatomy, the clitoris doesn't really make sense except for stimulation outside of intercourse. Seems like that's why it's there. So it seems like, it seems like we're designed for pleasure, at least independent of the conjugal act. And why is it immoral for the wife to get to completion? Let's say if the husband doesn't. Like, I don't understand how they can say that's intrinsically evil. I think the reality is, and they'll never come out and say, we can't let the man do it, so we sure can't let the woman do it. That'd be kind of unfair. And so you guys are both stuck with this, and that's my reading of it.
Yeah, I mean,
we need someone in the comments to come up and fight back for the trads and the theology of the body folks.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out exactly what I should say. So I think that this whole thing is the result of Aquinas trying to graft Aristotelianism onto Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it doesn't always make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Christianity is a product of the first century ancient Near East. Like Hellenistic culture, like the body was kind of like yuck, like ugh, body stuff. What's great is the pneuma. Like the pneuma is freaking where it's at, bro.
Yeah.
And I think that like clearly shows itself in, because I mean, what language was literally the entire New Testament written in? Greek. So are we shocked that it has Greek cultural underpinnings to it? No, right? And so I think that the broadly anti-sex sentiment that you find in the letters of Paul is not shocking. And then I think that Paul was writing when the world was ending. So sex didn't matter a whole lot.
Didn't need babies. Didn't want babies, really.
What's the point? The world's ending.
Yep.
Jesus is coming back like soon.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he didn't come back so soon. And now, 1,200 years later, Aquinas is trying to kind of graft, these kind of like ethics that came from Paul in a culture that didn't apply anymore, but now he's trying to make it apply for all times and places by kind of grafting like Aristotelian physics onto it.
I think it's actually, I think it's that and Augustine in between, because Augustine
Yes.
had his own problems, and some of the stuff that he said is bizarre. You know, I think if you get too much
Like we
enjoyment out
covered.
of it, even procreating, it's a mortal sin.
How
You know,
great would it be, said Aquinas, if we could all procreate the same way that we like labored in the fields? Like if we just
yeah,
kind of like,
yeah,
we could go and like work up a sweat and do a workout. And then like at the end of the day, if you're proud of the barn that you built or whatever, you could also be proud of like the, and wouldn't that be great if there was no like, pleasure involved, if it was just like
yep,
the sweat of your
yep,
brow?
yep.
That's weird.
That's Augustine, and then I think Aquinas is stuck. How do we make, reconcile this guy with our faith? And I think he tried to massage him as best he can, but unless Augustine's a doctor of the church, like who the heck's gonna say this guy is wrong?
And so keep in mind that the epistles were written in roughly 50. Augustine was writing in roughly 350, and then
Yeah.
Aquinas was what, 1250 or
Oh,
something.
yes.
So Augustine is much closer in time to Paul than he is to Aquinas. Also, it's kind of the same empire. Like it's 300 years, but it's Rome. Like Rome, and granted, the dominant language had changed. Augustine was writing in Latin, Paul was writing in Greek, so it is different. Like Rome culture beat out Greek culture over the course of those 300 years, so it is different. However, it's all the Roman Empire, the same Roman Empire that destroyed the Jewish temple in like 69 AD or whatever that was, 67 AD, something like that. That same Rome was the Rome in which Augustine was born into. And so it's not shocking.
That one wins
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. He was a wild guy. So
Yeah, he got to play and have fun, and then he has conversion, and then we all get to suffer from that.
yep.
I
He
don't
had
know.
his
It's hard not to.
Rumspringa.
Yeah, it's hard not to argue with that. So,
I think I did see a question from Daniel. That's Quasines. This might be a good question for you two. Do you see it above its question? Do we read into intrinsically evil in our own particular spin? If you could throw that up on the screen. Yeah, this is probably a good question for you guys. I don't know if I'll have a whole lot to say here, but what do you guys think?
well, and there's another comment too that I saw. It was quoting 2352. I'm gonna just put that up to 2352, that says that intrinsically and gravely disordered action. I think that's right. I think there may be some, but gravely disordered versus gravely evil, and even I think in the olden times, evil didn't necessarily mean it from the standpoint of sin the way we do. It was more of the violation of nature, and maybe that's. I know I've seen some people say that's what Aquinas was really arguing there, kind of getting back to the nature and stuff. But I don't know. You look at any examination of conscience, and it's Catholic answers or whatever. They're going to say no. This is evil, sinful. It's a mortal sin. You're going to go to hell if you don't confess it. I don't know. I don't think we're overreading that or misreading that, but maybe I am. It'd be nice if we are, someone would clear that up, because there's a lot of scrupulous people out there really suffering under the weight of it.
All I know is that if we do have to live according to these very strict sexual rules, all I can do is just hope in God's mercy, and probably most people will as well. I don't know how many people can really live this day to day through their whole married life without having issues.
I don't think they do. I really don't think they do. I don't think that many people obey these rules, except for like the really, really intense Catholics. And I think that there is probably a lot of really unhappy marriages and not all of them, obviously. Not all.
And that's where I think that like the way that I view marital debt occurring, that seems more sinful to me than a guy going solo because his wife is, having issues or whatever, and she's not really in the mood. It just, those things don't align for me as far as, solo being worse than marital debt.
So yes, right. I'm with you there, but that's not what the tradition of the Catholic Church would state, So, I agree with you, but that's easy for me to do because I'm not Catholic.
But it is funny though, and I know I mentioned this before, but I want to just point to this. Let's see. Let's see. Is that 2352? Yeah. So I'm going to put up 2352 just because I just find this such a striking. It says that both the magisterium of the church and the course of constant tradition and the moral sense of the faithful have been in no doubt and have firmly maintained that masturbation is an intrinsically and gravely disordered action. Who did they poll? When did they poll? I'm like,
am I not among the faithful?
It sounds like Phaser again. Well, anyone that is right says that it's intrinsically disordered, and those that didn't obviously have something wrong with them, so we're going to ignore their vote. Like this is so weird to me because it's arguing, well, we all agreed that this is the way it is, so that must be what it is. And is that really where it came from? You don't have a better explanation for why this is intrinsically disordered, intrinsically and gravely disordered? I don't know. I think if you took the same poll of all Catholics now, I think you'd get some pretty different results, substantially skewed the other way.
Yeah. So what's funny is I'm working on a script right now for a video about infallibility within the Catholic Church, and it might be Dei Verbum. I forget, but one encyclical or the other says that the Church is infallible when all of the faithful, and then it quotes Augustine, when all of the faithful, from the bishops down to the lay people, when they're all in agreement on a matter of faith and morals, the Church is infallible. And my question is, when have all Catholics ever agreed on anything ever?
Well, and who wants to be the person to stand up for the masturbator? So, you know what?
That's right.
Put their hand in the air.
Yeah. This hand, not that hand. I mean,
both hands.
Just so you know. Yeah. I mean, it's like, why do you beat your wife or whatever? That kind of a stupid loaded question. Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's true.
So I don't know. That disturbs me, because to me, of all those different sins that Aquinas taught, that seems to me the most harmless,
especially when nocturnal emission occurs naturally.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
So Aquinas actually does write about natural nocturnal emission. In that same question 154 in the second part of the second part. If you want to throw my screen up again, Aquinas. So we looked at Article 12 earlier, which here, let me just go back up to the top. So question 154, Article 12 is the order of gravity, and that's the one where he said that Eraptus wasn't as bad as Solo. But then if you go to Article 5, it says, is nocturnal pollution a mortal sin? And I know that you guys know this, but for the audience, the Summa is kind of written weird. Every article starts with, it's almost like he's arguing with himself. So he's going to present objections, and then he'll write, on the contrary, and then he'll explain why each objection is wrong. So objection, it would seem that nocturnal pollution is a sin, but then he says nocturnal pollution may be considered in two ways. First, in and of itself, and thus it is not the character of sin. For every sin depends on the judgment of reason. And he's pretty much saying here that like since it's not something that you reasoned to, then it like there's no sin. He says it here. There's no sin in it. So like if it just happens because you didn't want it to, but he says now during sleep reason has not a free judgment. For there is no one who while sleeping does not regard some of the images formed in his imagination as though they were real. So it's not a sin. But then he's saying here there is some way that it could be a sin.
If it's because you were looking at
yes
during the day or whatever, you're letting your mind
exactly.
Yeah.
But I always laugh about this part. When there's an excess of seminal humor in the body, or when the humor is disintegrated either through overheating the body or through some other disturbance, like the biology of the Summa is hilarious because it's all about the humors within the body. It's just very medieval and stuff. But what you said right there is exactly what Aquinas is saying. He's saying it in, medieval biological terms, but yeah, he's saying that nocturnal pollution can have the character of sin from its cause. And it's like what you said, if you were kind of entertaining all these thoughts throughout the day that you should have banished immediately, but you kind of like relished those thoughts, and then at night like that's a sin. But if you weren't doing that and it happens anyway, not a sin. So to be fair to Aquinas, he's more reasonable about nocturnal pollution than he is about Araptus.
He may have been an expert in that.
Yeah, he may have been. Golly, we're gonna get excommunicated.
Right. I mean, it's part of normal biological functioning, so I assume he was an expert in it to some degree.
I saw this comment and I'm glad someone reposted it because someone said that a priest had said that if you wake up during the middle of it, it's fine to finish the task.
No way. Really?
Well, just a priest said that in confession. I mean, you get all kinds of advice.
I don't know.
Wow.
It was a conservative priest, though.
Was it?
That's what they say.
I guess it depends. What do you define middle? Are you closer to the beginning?
Wondering that too.
Closer to the beginning or closer to the end? I think closer to the end, maybe the more.
I don't know, because then if you wake up in the middle of the night at all,
must be something being a priest in confession here in this.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that's interesting.
I won't get started because we've been going for 2 hours. But I have very strong objections to the idea that we should be sending children in to talk about this kind of stuff with priests. It does not sit right with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is the gateway sin. I mean, this is where most. I don't know. This thing really bothers me too, in that it's treated as the same level of gravity as all, or if you read Aquinas, worse than these other things. And it's no wonder that, I mean, I've heard that that's what Martin Luther went crazy with. He couldn't get this thing stopped, and he went off and started his own church. I mean, the level of suffering that people go through trying to.
Well, it is true. If you were a young teenager and the priest told you were going to hell if you didn't knock this off, it could really affect the rest of your life.
Yeah.
I was terrified of hell for a long time. By the time that I officially left religion, I wasn't terrified of hell anymore, because I think that I had spent enough time thinking things through before I actually. It's not like I left and then I started thinking things through. You know what I mean? That probably would have scared the living daylights out of me. But yeah, I mean, hell is a really good motivator for
It reminds me of my wife when the kids are being naughty, and they're not turning their Kindles off, and they're not getting ready to brush their teeth quickly enough, and so now she's threatening to cancel all future vacations and
Christmas.
It's just you go to threat level midnight for everything. That's the response to everything. Well, I'm gonna come up with the worst possible thing to get you to do what I want you to do in the moment. This feels a little bit like that sometimes.
True.
Have you seen? There's a show called The Good Place. It's a few years old at this point. So it's a comedy show, but it's a show about these 4 people who they die, they wake up, and they're told that they're in the good place. And actually, tell you what, I won't spoil the show, but I will say that at the very final season, like the very last few episodes, they wind up coming up with, like, these 4 humans come up with a radically redesigned afterlife, one that is very different from the traditional afterlife. And I can't help but think of it as being way better than what well, frankly, no, that's not true. I was going to say that all religions have come up with. I think it's actually very similar to the Mormon afterlife, which is funny. Do you guys know about the Mormon afterlife?
I always get that confused with the Jehovah's Witnesses. So why don't you clarify for us?
So the Mormons get a second chance. Sorry, not all the Mormons. Like, everybody gets a second chance. So you die, you wake up, and like you're kind of in like a purgatory kind of place almost, but like everybody goes there. And if you are already a Mormon, then you become like a teacher. And if you're not a Mormon, then you get like assigned to a teacher. And one of the teachers, they're going to like teach you about Mormonism again, because you didn't get to it while you were still alive, but that's fine. You get a second chance in the afterlife. And then you have until the moment of your death, until the second coming of Jesus, to actually get it right. And as long as you like accept the tenets of Mormonism or whatever, by the time that Jesus comes again, then you're good. And you're probably going to make it into the third and highest heaven. And even if you don't make it into the third and highest heaven, you might make it into the second heaven or even the third heaven, which they say that the third heaven is pretty much like the happiest that you can be on earth, which kind of sounds like limbo to us. Rest in peace, limbo, by the way. But I don't know. I think the Mormon afterlife is pretty beautiful because like second chances are awesome. And which Catholic theologian, it was a Vatican II theologian, I don't remember, wrote that like he was a universalist, and he thinks that like Jesus would descend into hell and like suffer right next to all of us until we decided to repent, because that's how much he loves us. And I think that's beautiful too. I think all of those things are way more beautiful than the version of the afterlife that I grew up learning, but that's another stream.
We've got a Universalist coming on in a month, so I'm really
Ooh,
that. So that'll be a good show.
I will say that if I became a theist again, I would almost definitely be a kind of universalist for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I know everybody deals with this fear of hell in a different way, and for me, and this, I'm not telling anybody this is the right way to do it. I should put up our do not take theological advice from us. I just concluded that if heaven is this difficult to get into, it really questions the notion that we have this loving God. And we have a loving God. I believe we have a loving God. And so it seems incompatible that we have a loving God and that 90% of us are going to hell. I mean, I hope that's not the case, but it doesn't really fit logically to me. And that's how I reconcile it. Hopefully I'm right.
Pick and choose in the live chat. Pointed out, I guess it's Jordan Daniel Wood. Honestly, that name is not ringing a bell for me, but I'm sure that Pick and Choose is correct, that it was Jordan Daniel Wood, the theologian, who said that
I don't know if he's kind of the guy for universalism now. We were kind of lucky to land him. Hopefully he still comes on after seeing this show.
Okay. Also, Murphy's Muskets pointed out that one of the writers on The Good Place was Mormon, and that actually makes a lot of sense because the afterlife that they create it's not exactly Mormonism, but I mean, it gets closer to Mormonism, I guess.
You know, it's strange because today, like literally today, a buddy of mine, his funeral was today. I couldn't make it, but his widow was telling me about, and I think he was a Christian of sorts, but not practicing and all. And she told me about what sounded like a very real near death kind of end of life. He saw heaven. It was a pleasant place. And that sounds like that sounds really attractive. I hope it's real. Like, I hope his experience was real. And people that talk about it, that's sort of the story that you hear. So I hope that's a better reflection of what's awaiting us than
the Pius the 12ths of the world.
And most near-death experiences are positive.
Yeah.
Somebody pointed out recently that I know it's not literally none, but most after near-death experiences and things like that, nobody ever sees purgatory, and I kind of thought that was really funny.
Yeah. I wonder why that is.
And I grew up thinking that like most of us,
Yeah.
and by us I meant like Catholics, would wind up
Yeah.
in purgatory. All the Novus Ordo swine are obviously going to go to hell, but most but if you're a normal trad, you'll wind up in purgatory for a couple thousand years or whatever. And if you're literally like Saint Teresa, then fine, you'll probably go like to heaven after going to purgatory for like a day or whatever. But then at the same time, we also believed in the first Saturday devotion or whatever, where like if you so I don't know, explain that to me. But
well,
anyway,
I still wear my scapular just
hey,
in
there it
case.
is.
I do too.
That was the first thing for me where my parents noticed that I was like not feeling it anymore, was I stopped wearing my scapular, and they knew I wasn't, because I was leaving it in my bedroom and stuff, and they were like, "We know that you're not wearing your scapular." I'm like, I know. I mean, oh well.
Yeah. Well, my phone is getting dinged, so I'm guessing I have a wife wanting to know where I'm at. So I'm gonna have to wrap this up. I wish we could keep doing this for a while, but this has been going on for 2 hours.
Yeah, nice and long stream. Thank you so much for having me on and letting me nerd out for like over an hour on this stuff. I hope that I've given Catholics who want to dissent from Pius XII a little bit of ammunition to do so. I think that what Pope Pius XII said is non-veridical. And I think that Catholics can find what I said to be useful, even if that makes them a little bit unorthodox, or perhaps it makes them a little bit uncharted.
Yeah, agreed. You are very articulate and you know your stuff, so I'm glad we were able to do this. And I think I'd like to see someone step forward and try and put Humpty Dumpty back together for us a little bit. I'm not really in a position to do that, so someone should be able to, if
You would think.
So
Third Vatican
Pager, if you're
Council.
out there listening, here's your chance. Come on the show with us. Put it all back together. All right. Okay. Thank you, Jonah. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. For everyone that was
Jonah.
in the chat. And until next time, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good one.